Today we will study the reunion of Joseph and Jacob. But what happened after that? Egypt was a very different land from Canaan. Sure, they loved Joseph in Egypt, naturally. But would they feel the same way about his family? This would be a cultural shock for certain. And in chapter 46, Joseph paves the way for them. He understands his family and the land of Egypt. So he works with Pharaoh to put it all together, to put them together. So we're going to finish up chapter 46 here first, reading verses 28 through 34. 46, 28 through 34. Now, Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. Now, as soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around him, around his father, and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh, and will say to him, My brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. Now when Pharaoh calls you in and asks, What is your occupation? You should answer, Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Now notice that Jacob sends Judah ahead. And the idea here is he was going to direct them to the land of Goshen. The brothers had never been there before. Now I do agree with the Zondervan Study Bible. Joseph was going to become the family leader, but that was in the land of Egypt. They had just gotten there, and so before they arrived, Jacob sends for Judah. Judah's the one who goes to Joseph and is the one who gets directions to Goshen. Now, what happens here is that once Jacob appeared before Joseph, Joseph threw his arms around his father and he wept for a very, very long time. So what a beautiful reunion this is. Now, Jacob can die in peace. He has finally set his eyes on Joseph once again. He saw for himself that Joseph was truly alive and well, something I'm sure he never imagined possible. Now, Joseph begins his work and putting these two cultures, two families, if you will, together. The Pharaoh and those close to him in Egypt, and of course his family from the land of Canaan. Now he will speak to the Pharaoh first and let them know that indeed his family has arrived in Goshen. Now, Pharaoh knew that was going to happen. He wanted to make sure that he knew it already had happened. Secondly, he will tell them they are shepherds. This, as we'll see, is very important. John MacArthur points out that he is preparing his family to secure the best possible place for them. He wants to do this right. He's very wise, indeed, Joseph is. Hinton feels the reason is because Joseph is concerned that Pharaoh may change his mind, even though he gave them carts so they could come, because there was an issue that had to be dealt with. Now, he also knew that Pharaoh would call some of them in. He knew this leader. He knew how the Pharaoh ran things, and told them they should say they are shepherds like their father before them was. They've done this since their boyhood. And that was important that he let them know that. Now, families, as we know, were very important to pharaohs historically. But here was the rub, and here was the concern that Joseph had. Verse 34 tells us, all shepherds were detestable to Egyptians. Now, All of the commentators have something to say about this. Seinfeld Study Bible didn't think this was a religious issue as much, which was why, of course, the Egyptians wouldn't eat with the Hebrews. We talked about that before. He thought it was a social issue. Now, MacArthur believed the Hebrews had certain social and religious stigmas among the Egyptians as well. And Joseph, of course, knew not all the Egyptians would probably welcome his family. But if Pharaoh approved, all would fall in line. It helped that Goshen was on the eastern end. And why that would help is they'd be a bit removed from the populace of Egypt. Hinton suggests that perhaps they would be more accepted on the outskirts. MacArthur agrees. Joseph's plans separated them a bit from the mainstream Egyptian authority. So basically what Joseph's trying to do is he's trying to protect all that were involved. Now, Linda Hinton admits, historically, we really don't know why they detested shepherds, Egyptians. She suggests a very interesting theory. Perhaps it was the outdoor life and the uncleanness, if you will, that was detestable. It certainly was a very dirty job, not the kind of work many in Egypt were used to. It was very different than breeding cattle, which that now was a very big part of the Egyptian culture, and it was done very differently. It seems the Egyptians did not raise sheep. Now let's take a look at 47. We're going to get 12 verses in today on chapter 47. And tomorrow we're going to finish up the rest of 47 and as we're winding down here in the story of Joseph. So let's take a look at Genesis 47 verses 1 through 12. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers with their flocks and herds had everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose five of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here for a while because the famine is so severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with a special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." How about that, huh? Verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. And after Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of the Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So you see, Joseph told Pharaoh all about them. Joseph chose 5 of the brothers to present. Now it's interesting, we're not told who they were. I'd like to know, how about you? Judah? Was he involved? Benjamin? Reuben, because he was the oldest? We have no idea, and which is weird. None of the commentaries I read even speculated, which is unusual. Commentaries do that from time to time. Now, the brothers do a very convincing job here, adding they have no pastures due to the famine. Now, they make a request. They do not assume, and guess what? It works. Joseph coached them well. Starting in verse 5, we see that they get the Pharaoh's blessing. And not only that, Pharaoh asks if there are any with special abilities so that he could put them in charge of his livestock, which Linda Hinton thinks were probably cattle. Now, again, raising cattle were different, but offering that to his family for his private livestock, that's pretty awesome. Now, let's focus on this next part. It's fascinating. Jacob is presented before the Pharaoh. Now, the first thing Jacob does is bless the Pharaoh. That's interesting to me. Now, hints suggest it was probably the customary Hebrew blessing, which involved prosperity, it involved security, and long life, which is interesting because the first question the Pharaoh asked Jacob is, how old are you? Now, MacArthur agrees that this is pretty unusual, pretty cool, adding a historical fact. See, he believes that this was Senusert III, a young man who took the responsibility from his father during the famine. And he honored all of his father's commitments to Joseph. So obviously family was very important to Senusert. He honored his father's obligations. Now, his father did not live nearly as long as Jacob did. Jacob replies that he's 130. Now, it sounds like a long time, and it's certainly longer than people live now. But Abraham, his grandfather, lived to 175, and Isaac, his father, lived till he was 180. So that's why he says it's been a few years, right? A few years. Not exaggerating, compared to 175 and 180, I guess 130 is only a few years. But it's interesting how he describes his pilgrimage. He says that it was difficult. He describes it as being tough. He struggled with his father when he was younger. He struggled with his brother as well. His children, there were some struggles there. His wives. And of course, he had a lot of hard years thinking Joseph was long gone. The famine certainly didn't help. The NIV is being nice here, actually. Other versions of the Bible say that he described his years as evil. Strong word. But he was very honest in painting a picture that his life had not been easy by any means. Well, Joseph's masterful plan works perfectly. Verse 11 tells us that they settled in the best part of the land, and the move had Pharaoh's seal of approval after all. Now, you might be wondering why it's called the District of Ramses. First time we've ever heard it called that. It's always been referred to as Goshen up to this point. But historically, this is a very important designation. And this is probably for historical reasons. Remember, we're getting towards Exodus. So history here is important. Very soon, the Ramses would gain the pharaohship. And this, of course, would bleed right into the Exodus. It's a precursor, if you will, just giving us advance notice of what's going to be happening. Now, apparently that family came from this region as well. This is a part of the transition into that next book. Now, we also begin another transition, and that is into the next part of the story. Now, the next part of the story, and we'll cover this next time in more detail, is that the famine was going to go on for 5 more years. We knew that. But now, things were going from bad to worse. And even before we get into that story, we have an indication that it was happening already. The language in verse 12 here suggests that food was restricted. Notice, each member of Joseph's family received food according to their number of children. So, indeed, moving to Egypt really saved their lives, and we'll get a lot of details about life during that famine as we finish chapter 47 the next time. And until then, blessings, grace, and peace.